December 20th, 1944, Luxembourg City. The telephone line crackled with barely suppressed fury as General Omar Bradley gripped the receiver, his knuckles wide against the black bakelite. Across the wire came Dwight Eisenhower's measured voice, delivering an order that would test their friendship to its breaking point. Two American armies, the 1st and the 9th, are being placed under British command. Under Montgomery's command. By God, Ike, I cannot be responsible to the American people if you do this. Bradley erupted, his Missouri composure finally shattering. I resign, the Supreme Commander's response came cold and precise. Brad, I, not you, am responsible to the American people. Your resignation therefore means absolutely nothing. Bradley paused, made one more protest, then fell silent. This moment, buried in the chaos of Hitler's Ardennes offensive, crystallized 3 years of mounting American frustration with a British Field Marshal who seemed determined to prove he alone could win the war. Bernard L. Montgomery, victor of El Alamein, hero of Britain, had become the most divisive figure in the Allied command structure. But the question that haunted American headquarters from Tunisia to Germany was simpler and more damning. Why did a coalition fighting for survival against Nazi tyranny find itself torn apart not by the enemy, but by the personality of one man? The answer lay not in a single incident, but in an accumulation of moments, decisions, and clashes that began in North African sand and ended in the mud of Northwest Europe. This is the story of how military genius became military burden, how national pride collided with Allied necessity, and how the Americans came to view their most prominent British battlefield commander with emotions ranging from exasperation to something approaching loathing. The mathematics of Allied command were deceptively simple, but politically complex. By late 1944, American forces in Europe outnumbered British troops by substantial margins. American industrial output dwarfed Britain's war-stretched economy. Yet Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery seemed constitutionally incapable of acknowledging these realities or adjusting his behavior accordingly. To American eyes, Montgomery represented everything they had fought a revolution to escape: aristocratic presumption, colonial condescension, and an unshakable belief in British superiority. But Montgomery was no caricature. He was genuinely brilliant, meticulous in preparation, careful with his soldiers' lives in ways that endeared him to his troops. His victories were real, his tactical acumen undeniable. British soldiers, battered by early war defeats, had found in Montgomery a commander who won battles while keeping casualty list manageable. Churchill cherished him. The British public adored him. None of this mattered to American commanders, who found themselves repeatedly sidelined, patronized, and publicly diminished by a field marshal who seemed to view them as enthusiastic amateurs, requiring British guidance. The friction began not with grand strategic disputes, but with something far more personal: respect, or the lack thereof. From their first encounters in North Africa through the final victory in Germany, American commanders would discover that Montgomery's treatment of them revealed assumptions about American competence, American courage, and American worth that cut deeper than any battlefield disagreement. March 6, 1943, Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. The desert wind carried the acrid smell of burned vehicles and defeat across the Tunisian landscape as Lieutenant General George S. Patton stepped off his plane, arriving to assume command of the battered 2nd Corps. 20 days earlier, German forces under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had savaged American units in their first major engagement with veteran Wehrmacht troops. The defeat had been comprehensive, humiliating, and instructive. What greeted Patton was not merely a demoralized command, but a British command structure that viewed American forces as unreliable. Auxiliaries requiring careful supervision. General Sir Harold Alexander, the new British commander of 18th Army Group overseeing all Allied ground forces in Tunisia, had drafted a report on American combat performance that read like an indictment. American commanders lacked experience, American troops lacked discipline, American units required extensive British oversight before they could be trusted with significant responsibilities. The report was not entirely unfair. Kasserine Pass had exposed genuine deficiencies in American leadership, tactics, and combined arms coordination. But Alexander's response went beyond corrective criticism. In his view, the 2nd Corps should be assigned supporting roles while British forces executed the primary attacks. Patton understood immediately what was at stake. this was not merely about defeating Rommel. It was about proving that American arms could stand alongside their British counterparts as equals. His diary entries from this period documented British presumption and his determination to prove American worth through aggressive action. Montgomery, commanding the British Eighth Army approaching Tunisia from the east, embodied the British assumptions Patton resented. The victor of El Alamein carried himself with the confidence of a commander who had reversed Britain's fortunes in the desert. He had driven Rommel across North Africa through methodical, carefully prepared operations that emphasized overwhelming material superiority rather than tactical flair. His soldiers trusted him because he won without wasting their lives unnecessarily. But his manner suggested that he alone understood modern warfare and that others, particularly Americans, had much to learn. Alexander's operational plan for the final Tunisia campaign reflected these assumptions. Montgomery's Eighth Army would deliver the primary blow against the Mareth Line, the Axis fortifications in southern Tunisia. Patton's the Second Corps would conduct supporting attacks, drawing German attention away from Montgomery's main effort. The Americans would serve as Montgomery's shield while the British won the glory of breaking through to Tunis. The plan had military logic. Montgomery commanded veteran troops with proven success against German armor. Patton led formations still learning their trade, but the allocation of missions carried implications beyond tactical prudence. It established expectations that would haunt American commanders throughout the war. British forces taking the lead, American forces providing support, British commanders receiving credit. While American achievements went unnoticed or minimized, Patton launched his offensive toward El Qatar on March 17, 1943, determined to prove American competence through aggressive action. His orders reflected his personality, mixing tactical guidance with demands for aggressive leadership. Officers would lead from the front. American troops would show the same aggressive spirit that had characterized their entry into the First World War. Whatever the cost, the Second Corps would demonstrate that it deserved to be treated as a combat force rather than occupation troops. The Battle of El Qatar provided vindication. On March 23rd, 50 German tanks of the 10th Panzer Division emerged from mountain passes into the valley, executing a dawn attack designed to shatter American defenses. What followed shocked the German commanders. American artillery, in place with careful attention to overlapping fields of fire, unleashed devastating concentrations on the advancing armor. Tank destroyers, positioned to exploit terrain advantages, engaged the panzers at ranges that negated German tactical superiority. By day's end, the battlefield was littered with destroyed German vehicles, and the 10th Panzer Division had been stopped cold. For the first time, American forces had defeated experienced German armored units in sustained combat, but the victory carried a bitter aftertaste. Alexander's headquarters, focused on Montgomery's operations against the Mareth Line, paid minimal attention to the Second Corps' success. British staff officers continued to issue detailed instructions to Patton, micromanaging American operations in ways that suggested persistent doubts about American competence. More galling still, Alexander repeatedly changed the Second Corps' objectives, shifting priorities in ways that appeared designed to ensure American forces remained auxiliary to British operations. Patton would be ordered to advance, then halt, attack with armor, then lead with infantry. Each change disrupted American operations and signaled that the Second Corps existed primarily to facilitate Montgomery's plans rather than to achieve independent objectives. When Montgomery finally attacked the Mareth Line on March 20th, his initial assault made little progress against determined German resistance. He adapted by shifting his main effort to an outflanking maneuver, demonstrating the flexibility that characterized his best operations. But the modification required time, allowing German forces to establish new defensive positions. By the time the Eighth Army broke through, the opportunity for a decisive pursuit had passed. The Second Corps continued its supporting attacks in central Tunisia, drawing German reserves away from Montgomery's front. American forces advanced steadily, taking objectives and inflicting casualties on Axis forces. But these achievements went largely unacknowledged in British reporting. Montgomery's breakthrough received extensive publicity. Patton's contribution, equally important to the overall campaign, merited minimal mention. When the victory parade was held in Tunis on May 20, 1943, with General Eisenhower, Alexander, and French General Henry Giraud taking the salute, The narrative emphasized British and French achievements, while American contributions received cursory acknowledgement. For American commanders, Tunisia provided lessons that went beyond tactics and logistics. They learned that fighting alongside the British meant fighting for recognition as well as victory. They discovered that Montgomery, whatever his military talents, seemed incapable of treating American forces as genuine partners rather than promising apprentices. And they began to suspect that this attitude reflected not just Montgomery's personality, but a broader British unwillingness to accept that the balance of power in the alliance had shifted irrevocably toward Washington. These lessons would prove prophetic when the Allies turned their attention to the next objective, Sicily, July 10, 1943, Gulf of Gela, Sicily. The largest amphibious assault in history to that point rolled toward the shores of Sicily. As Operation Husky, the invasion of Italy's largest island, commenced in darkness and heavy seas. Over 8 divisions, divided between General Bernard Montgomery's British 8th Army and General George Patton's American 7th Army, stormed beaches from Cape Scaramia to Syracuse, in an operation that would test Allied unity as thoroughly as it tested German and Italian defenses. The plan for Operation Husky had been contentious from its inception. Initial proposals envisioned landings dispersed across Sicily, seizing ports quickly to ensure adequate supply for subsequent operations. Montgomery detested dispersed landings. His experience in North Africa had convinced him that concentration of force was paramount, that scattering troops invited defeat in detail. On April 24, 1943, he articulated his objections and proposed an alternative: concentrate all landings on Sicily's southeastern corner, giving the 8th Army the clear mission of driving straight to Messina, the island's northeastern port and the gateway to mainland Italy. Air Marshal Arthur Tedder and Admiral Andrew Cunningham, responsible for air and naval operations, respectively, opposed Montgomery's plan. It would leave 13 Axis airfields operational, posing unacceptable risks to the invasion fleet. It would require ships to remain concentrated in limited waters, vulnerable to air attack. Their objections carried weight. Both men commanded respect earned through successful operations. Montgomery's response revealed the full force of his personality. He threatened, with Churchill's backing, to resign rather than execute a plan he considered fundamentally flawed. Faced with a crisis that threatened to derail the entire invasion, Eisenhower called a conference for May 2 to resolve the dispute. The meeting exposed fault lines that would widen throughout the war. Montgomery presented his case with confidence bordering on arrogance. Tedder and Cunningham pushed back, defending the importance of airfields and naval security. Eisenhower, attempting to balance military necessities against coalition politics, ultimately sided with Montgomery. The landings would be concentrated in southeastern Sicily, with the 8th Army driving toward Messina and the 7th Army protecting the 8th Army's left flank. For Patton, reading the final plan in North Africa while preparing his command for invasion, the implications were unmistakable. The 7th Army would play a supporting role. Montgomery would lead the main attack. The British would take Messina while Americans guarded their flank. Once again, American forces were relegated to secondary missions while British commanders pursued glory. The decision rankled for reasons beyond Patton's considerable ego. By July 1943, American forces in the Mediterranean theater had grown substantially. 7th Army comprised 3 infantry divisions, an armored division, and substantial support troops, a force comparable in size to 8th Army. American industrial output was flooding Allied stockpiles with equipment. American air power dominated Mediterranean skies. Yet the command structure treated American forces as auxiliaries to be employed at British discretion. Patton's diary entry from July 12 captured his frustration with brutal clarity. Alexander and his entirely British staff had visited 7th Army headquarters to present the operational plan, a plan that in Patton's view cut Americans off from any possibility of taking Messina. He noted bitterly that Alexander, commanding British and American armies, arrived with no American officers on his staff. "What fools we are," Patton wrote, recognizing that American political leaders had accepted a command arrangement that guaranteed American marginalization. The landings themselves went reasonably well despite chaotic airborne operations that saw British and American paratroopers scattered across the countryside, many drowning when their gliders crashed into the Mediterranean. By dawn on July 10th, both armies had secured their beachheads and were pushing inland. Initial resistance from Italian coastal divisions crumbled quickly. German counterattacks against Gela Beach, where Patton's forces landed, were defeated with the assistance of naval gunfire and determined fighting by the 1st Infantry Division. Montgomery, confident that Axis resistance would collapse before methodical British pressure, signaled Alexander that the route to Messina lay open. His 8th Army would drive straight up the eastern coast. Patton's 7th Army should hold defensively, protecting 8th Army's flank while Montgomery pursued what he assumed would be a demoralized enemy. The signal revealed Montgomery's assumptions. British forces would deliver the knockout blow. American forces would provide security. Reality intruded swiftly. German forces, far from collapsing, established strong defensive positions, exploiting Sicily's mountainous terrain. 8th Army's advance bogged down south of Catania, where German paratroopers held positions that channelized British attacks into killing zones. Montgomery's methodical approach, so effective in the desert, struggled against defenders who could concentrate forces on narrow fronts and fight from prepared positions. On July 12th, as the 8th Army's advance stalled, Montgomery sent a signal to Alexander that would define Anglo-American relations. For the remainder of the war, he proposed that the 8th Army expand its operational area westward, effectively commandeering a key road assigned to 7th Army. The expanded frontage would allow him to outflank German positions blocking his advance. American forces should, he suggested, halt and defend while the 8th Army executed the offensive that would cut Sicily in half. The signal's tone was as significant as its content. Montgomery did not request Alexander's approval. He informed Alexander of his intentions and suggested that American forces adjust accordingly. The presumption was staggering. Montgomery was proposing to appropriate American operational areas, relegate American forces to static defense, and execute a strategy that ensured British forces alone would gain credit for Sicily's conquest. Alexander, whose admiration for Montgomery outweighed his confidence in American commanders, agreed. On July 13th, he issued an order assigning Montgomery the disputed road and instructing Patton to hold defensively while the 8th Army advanced. For the American commanders reading the order, the message was unmistakable. British preferences would determine Allied strategy regardless of American contributions or capabilities. Patton's initial response demonstrated the political constraints that frustrated American commanders throughout the war. Despite his fury, expressed in diary entries comparing Montgomery to an arrogant prima donna and Alexander to an incompetent sycophant, Patton formally accepted the order without protest. He understood that Eisenhower, commanding Allied forces in the Mediterranean, could not afford open revolt by subordinate commanders. Coalition warfare required compromise and accommodation, even when compromise meant swallowing justified anger. But Patton had no intention of allowing the 7th Army to sit idle while Montgomery pursued victory. If Alexander would not assign Americans a primary mission, Patton would create one. He flew to Alexander's headquarters on July 17th, carrying a map and a proposal. Rather than defend passively, 7th Army would drive northwest toward Palermo, Sicily's capital and principal port. The operation would cut the island in half, trap Italian forces in western Sicily, and secure port facilities that would ease American supply difficulties. Alexander, perhaps surprised by Patton's initiative or simply relieved to see American aggression directed away from Montgomery's operations, approved. The decision fundamentally altered the Sicily campaign. Rather than a single British advance up the east coast, supported by American defensive operations, the Allies would now conduct separate drives. Montgomery would continue pushing toward Messina from the south and east. Patton would race to Palermo, then turn east and drive toward Messina along Sicily's northern coast. What began as a strategic adjustment rapidly became a personal competition. Patton, determined to prove American capabilities and reach Messina before Montgomery, drove his command with characteristic intensity. 7th Army moved with a speed that shocked both allies and enemies, covering rugged terrain at rates Montgomery's methodical approach could never match. Just 12 days after landing, American troops entered Palermo on July 22nd, capturing Sicily's largest city and a major port. Montgomery, meanwhile, continued grinding against German defenses south of Mount Etna. His progress was measured, professional, and increasingly irrelevant to the campaign's outcome. German forces, recognizing that Sicily could not be held, had begun preparing for evacuation to mainland Italy. The question was no longer whether the Allies would conquer Sicily, but which Allied army would reach Messina first and claim the symbolic victory. The race to Messina revealed character as much as capability. Patton pushed 7th Army to the limits of endurance, demanding relentless advance regardless of obstacles or casualties. His corps' commanders, accustomed to his style, drove their divisions hard. American engineers repaired roads and bridges with remarkable speed. American infantry marched through heat and mountainous terrain at paces that left support units struggling to keep pace. Montgomery's 8th Army, facing stronger opposition on more difficult terrain, advanced methodically. British commanders, trained to minimize casualties and husband resources, refused to risk disasters in pursuit of speed. The contrast illustrated fundamental differences in American and British military cultures. Americans, with vast manpower reserves and industrial capacity, could afford tactical risks and heavy casualties. The British, fighting since 1939 with dwindling manpower and an exhausted economy, could not. But the race was also personal. Montgomery's public statements and private correspondence revealed that he considered the 8th Army's mission more important and more difficult than 7th Army's operations. American success in reaching Palermo, from Montgomery's perspective, demonstrated nothing significant. Patton had faced weak Italian opposition in secondary terrain. The 8th Army confronted veteran German troops in positions that favored defense. The comparison Montgomery implied was meaningless. American commanders saw Montgomery's dismissal of their achievements as characteristic British condescension. They had heard similar assessments in Tunisia. American successes were minimized. American difficulties explained by inexperience. American commanders patronized as enthusiastic, but untutored. This attitude suggested that British respect for American arms was purely conditional, extended only when American forces operated under British command guidance, and for British objectives. On August 17, 1943, elements of Patton's 3rd Infantry Division entered Messina several hours before British forces arrived. The 7th Army had won the race, but the victory was hollow in ways that reflected the toxic state of Allied command relationships. Montgomery's public reaction combined graciousness with subtle dismissal. He congratulated Patton while emphasizing the difficulties the 8th Army had faced, and implying that terrain, rather than competence, explained outcomes. British press coverage reflected Montgomery's framing. Reports celebrated the 8th Army as fighting against the Germans, while treating the 7th Army's advance as a sideshow against inferior opposition. American achievements were acknowledged but diminished, presented as complementary to rather than equal with British operations. For American commanders reading these accounts, the message was clear. British narratives would always center British achievements regardless of objective evidence. The Sicily campaign left scars that would never fully heal. American commanders had demonstrated that their forces could match British troops in operational tempo and combat effectiveness, but recognition from their British counterparts remained grudging and conditional. Montgomery, in particular, seemed constitutionally unable to acknowledge that American commanders might possess skills comparable to his own, or that American forces might deserve credit commensurate with their contributions. 2 incidents during the Sicily campaign further poisoned relationships. On August 3rd and again on August 10th, Patton slapped hospitalized soldiers he accused of cowardice, triggering a scandal that would haunt his career. When word reached Montgomery, his response was coldly dismissive. Patton's behavior confirmed British assumptions about American indiscipline and emotionalism. A British commander, Montgomery suggested, would never lose control in such fashion. The second incident involved a young British Lieutenant Montgomery sent to Patton's headquarters as liaison officer. The lieutenant arrived with a suitcase tied with string, a shabby appearance that enraged Patton. Earlier, Patton had sent Montgomery a full liaison team, including a colonel, a major, and a complete communications section. In exchange, Montgomery had dispatched a single junior officer with inadequate equipment. Patton sent the lieutenant back with a note explaining that he could not permit boys in his headquarters. The incident was minor, almost comical, but it captured the casual disrespect that characterized Montgomery's treatment of American counterparts. Patton commanded an army equal in size to Montgomery's 8th Army. He deserved, by any standard of professional courtesy, liaison officers of appropriate rank and competence. Montgomery's failure to provide them suggested that he viewed 7th Army as subordinate regardless of official command relationships. As Allied planners turned their attention to the invasion of Italy and eventually to Operation Overlord, the cross-channel invasion of France. One fact had become indisputable: Bernard Montgomery viewed himself as the preeminent Allied battlefield commander, and expected deference from American subordinates accordingly. That American commanders increasingly viewed Montgomery as the primary obstacle to genuine Anglo-American partnership seemed not to register with the British Field Marshal, or perhaps it simply did not matter. September 1st, 1944, northern France. The Allied breakout from Normandy had shattered German defenses in France, sending Wehrmacht forces reeling eastward in headlong retreat. Paris had been liberated on August 25, 1944, amid jubilant scenes that seemed to confirm the war's imminent end. From Normandy beaches to Belgium, Allied armies pursued defeated enemies across terrain where, just months earlier, German forces had appeared unbeatable. Victory, perhaps by Christmas, seemed within grasp. For Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, recently promoted and basking in the glory of Normandy's success, the moment demanded bold action. He had commanded all Allied ground forces during the Normandy invasion, a responsibility that, combined with his earlier victories in North Africa and Sicily, confirmed his status as Britain's greatest battlefield commander. Now, with German armies in disarray, Montgomery saw an opportunity to end the war with a single decisive thrust. But September 1st also brought a change that Montgomery resented with barely concealed fury. General Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, assumed personal command of all Allied ground forces. Montgomery, who had exercised operational control of both American and British armies during Normandy, was now reduced to commanding 21st Army Group, the British and Canadian forces fighting in Northwest Europe. His American counterpart, General Omar Bradley, commanded the 12th Army Group, comprising the American 1st, 3rd, and 9th Armies. The change was inevitable. American forces in Europe now outnumbered British and Canadian troops substantially. American logistics sustained Allied operations. American air power dominated European skies. American industrial capacity provided the material foundation for Allied victory. Political reality demanded American command of a coalition that had become overwhelmingly American in composition. Montgomery understood the politics but accepted neither the necessity nor the implications. In his view, dispersing command authority among multiple headquarters diluted the decisive leadership that victory required. Eisenhower, whatever his political skills, lacked the battlefield experience to direct ground operations effectively. The supreme commander's role, Montgomery argued with increasing stridency, should be limited to political and logistical coordination. Operational command should remain concentrated in the hands of a single ground forces commander, someone with Montgomery's proven battlefield credentials. The proposal had one obvious beneficiary, Montgomery himself, but the Field Marshal presented his case as military necessity, rather than personal ambition. Eisenhower's planned strategy, advancing into Germany on a broad front with multiple armies attacking simultaneously, was, Montgomery insisted, strategically unsound. It dispersed resources, prevented decisive concentration, and guaranteed that the war would drag into 1945. Montgomery's alternative was characteristically bold and characteristically self-centered. Rather than a broad front advance, the Allies should concentrate forces for a single powerful thrust into northern Germany. This thrust would cross the Rhine, seize the Ruhr industrial region, and drive to Berlin before German forces could establish coherent defenses. Montgomery would naturally command this decisive operation, with American forces providing support and protecting flanks. The proposal's military merits were debatable. A narrow thrust deep into Germany would create an elongated salient vulnerable to counterattack. It would require abandoning operations elsewhere, allowing German forces to concentrate against the advance. It depended on capturing bridges intact and maintaining supply lines over hundreds of miles of contested territory. Most fundamentally, it assumed that German resistance had collapsed to the point where a rapid advance would face minimal opposition. But the proposal's political implications were unmistakable. Montgomery was asking American political leaders to subordinate their armies to British command for an operation that would ensure British forces under British leadership deliver the decisive blow ending the war. He was requesting that American troops serve as Montgomery's shield, while the British Field Marshal achieved final victory. And he was demanding, in effect, that Eisenhower surrender operational control to a subordinate who made no secret of his contempt for the Supreme Commander's strategic judgment. Eisenhower, attempting to balance military necessities against coalition politics, compromised. He would not concentrate all forces for Montgomery's northern thrust, but he would give Montgomery priority for supplies and authorize a limited operation to seize bridges across the Rhine in the Netherlands. Operation Market Garden, as the plan was designated, would employ 3 airborne divisions to capture bridges at Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem. British ground forces would then advance rapidly across the captured bridges, establish a bridgehead over the Rhine, and position themselves for subsequent operations into Germany. For American commanders, particularly Bradley and Patton, Montgomery's latest scheme confirmed their worst suspicions. The Field Marshal was once again attempting to relegate American forces to supporting roles, while British troops pursued glory. He was demanding supplies that might otherwise sustain American advances in central France, and he was proposing an operation whose risks seemed wildly disproportionate to potential gains. Patton, commanding 3rd Army driving toward Germany through eastern France, exploded when he learned that fuel allocations were being shifted to Montgomery. His army had demonstrated during August that aggressive American operations could advance faster and farther than cautious British movements. The 3rd Army was approaching the German border and the Rhine River, yet Eisenhower was halting American operations to resource a British Field Marshal, whose track record suggested methodical caution rather than operational boldness. Bradley, normally more diplomatic than Patton, shared his subordinates' frustration. Montgomery requested resources, threatened dire consequences if denied, and received priority regardless of American needs or achievements. The politics of coalition warfare, Bradley recognized, guaranteed that British demands would receive sympathetic hearings, even as American forces provided the bulk of Allied combat power. September 17, 1944, the Netherlands. Operation Market Garden commenced with the largest airborne operation in history. Over 35,000 American and British paratroopers dropped from transport aircraft and glided into Dutch fields, tasked with seizing bridges before German forces could destroy them. British ground forces, led by the 30th Corps, began advancing north along a single highway, racing to relieve airborne units before German counterattacks overwhelmed them. The operation failed comprehensively. Intelligence had detected German armor units near Arnhem, the northernmost objective, but these warnings were dismissed. Airborne forces landed too far from their objectives, allowing Germans to organize defense. The single highway became a death trap, with British armor unable to advance quickly or maneuver off roads bordered by marshland. German resistance, far from collapsing, intensified as Wehrmacht commanders recognized the threat and rushed reinforcements to the battle. At Arnhem Bridge, British paratroopers under Lieutenant Colonel John Frost held one end against overwhelming odds. For days, expecting relief that never came, the 30th Corps, stalled by German counterattacks and unable to bypass destroyed bridges, never reached Arnhem. By September 25th, when the operation was abandoned, over 17,000 Allied troops had been killed, wounded, or captured. The butcher's bill included roughly 6,400 paratroopers who had landed at Arnhem, most now dead or prisoners. The failure was total. The Rhine remained uncrossed. German defenses in the Netherlands solidified. Allied momentum, which in early September had seemed unstoppable, dissipated in Dutch fields. And along a highway the British would later call Hell's Highway, and the opportunity to end the war in 1944 evaporated in what would prove to be Montgomery's most catastrophic mistake. American reactions combined vindication with anger. Patton and Bradley had opposed Market Garden, arguing that its risks outweighed potential benefits. They had suggested that resources allocated to Montgomery's scheme would be better employed continuing American advances toward Germany. Their objections had been dismissed, overruled by political necessities and Montgomery's insistent certainty. Now, with Market Garden's failure undeniable, American commanders felt entitled to some satisfaction that events had confirmed their judgment. But satisfaction was overwhelmed by fury at Montgomery's response to the disaster. Rather than accepting responsibility for an operation he had conceived, planned, and commanded, Montgomery characterized Market Garden as 90% successful. The bridges at Eindhoven and Nijmegen had been captured. Allied forces had liberated substantial Dutch territory. That Arnhem, the operation's primary objective, had not been secured was presented as a minor setback in an otherwise triumphant campaign. The claim was breathtaking in its dishonesty. Market Garden's purpose was to establish a bridgehead over the Rhine. This had not been achieved. The operation had cost over 17,000 casualties for no strategic gain. Yet Montgomery was declaring victory, rewriting failure as success through sheer force of personality. American commanders recognized the maneuver for what it was, Montgomery protecting his reputation at the cost of truth. When Montgomery succeeded, credit was his alone. When operations faltered, explanations involved inadequate resources, insufficient support, or others' failures. Personal responsibility for setbacks was conspicuously absent from Montgomery's narrative. But Montgomery's most egregious offense was still to come. In the aftermath of Market Garden, as Allied operations transitioned to grinding advances against strengthened German defenses, Montgomery began publicly criticizing Eisenhower's strategy. The broad front approach, he argued in comments to British press and in signals to Churchill, had squandered the opportunity for decisive victory. Had his plan been adopted, had he received the resources and authority he requested, the war would be over. The critique ignored inconvenient realities. Montgomery had received substantial resources from Market Garden. The operation's failure resulted from flawed planning, intelligence mistakes, and underestimating German capabilities rather than from inadequate support. The Montgomeryist narrative transformed the operational incompetence into a missed opportunity supposedly caused by other strategic short-sightedness. For American commanders, Montgomery's deflection confirmed that the field marshal would never acknowledge personal error. Every setback became someone else's failure. Every success was his triumph. This pattern suggested not just vanity, but something more corrosive, a fundamental incapacity for honest self-assessment that made Montgomery dangerous to Allied unity, even as his tactical skills remained valuable. December 16, 1944, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. At dawn, German forces launched their last great offensive in the West, attacking through the Ardennes in a desperate gamble to split Allied armies and seize the port of Antwerp. The assault achieved complete surprise, smashing into thinly held American positions and creating a bulge in Allied lines. That would give the battle its name. For 10 days, the outcome hung in balance as German spearheads drove toward the Meuse River, threatening to fracture Allied defenses and prolong the war indefinitely. The Battle of the Bulge became Montgomery's finest and worst moment simultaneously. His military performance was exemplary. When Eisenhower transferred command of American 1st and 9th Armies to Montgomery on December 20th, the Field Marshal immediately imposed order on confused defensive operations. He positioned British reserves to defend the Meuse crossings. He coordinated American counterattacks. He demonstrated under genuine crisis conditions why Britain valued his leadership. But Montgomery's conduct after the battle sowed bitterness that would persist decades after the war. On January 7, 1945, with German forces in full retreat and Allied victory assured, Montgomery held a press conference ostensibly to praise American troops and defend Eisenhower. What emerged instead was a masterclass in self-promotion disguised as gracious compliment. Montgomery began by praising the American soldiers' fighting qualities, but he quickly pivoted to describing his own actions upon taking command. Actions presented as decisive interventions that saved American forces from disaster. As soon as I saw what was happening, Montgomery explained, I took certain steps myself to ensure that if the Germans got to the Meuse, they would certainly not get over that river. He continued, describing how he had tidied up the battlefield, how he had thought ahead, how he had ensured balanced dispositions. The battle, Montgomery concluded, had been most interesting. Possibly one of the most interesting and tricky battles he had ever handled. Throughout the recitation, British actions were highlighted, Montgomery's brilliance emphasized, and American commanders conspicuously absent from the narrative. The performance was a calculated insult disguised as a compliment. Montgomery praised American soldiers while implying they had been saved by his superior leadership. He credited American courage while suggesting that American commanders had been overwhelmed by events until British professionalism imposed order, and he characterized a desperate defensive battle, won primarily by American units like the 101st Airborne at Bastogne, and by Patton's rapid counterattack from the south, as a Montgomery triumph. The American reaction was explosive. Bradley, reading press reports at the conference, felt profound betrayal. Montgomery had commanded 2 American armies for barely 3 weeks. Those armies had fought magnificently, holding against overwhelming odds until German offensive momentum exhausted itself. Patton's Third Army had executed a brilliant counterattack, pivoting 90 in winter conditions to relieve Bastogne. American soldiers had paid in blood to defeat Hitler's final gamble. Yet Montgomery's narrative minimized American contributions and elevated his own role to central importance. This was not merely vanity. It was historical theft, an attempt to rewrite American victory as British rescue. And it was. American commanders recognized Montgomery's authentic view of events. He genuinely believed that his intervention had saved American forces. He saw nothing inappropriate in claiming credit for a battle won overwhelmingly by troops he had commanded for less than a month. The press conference triggered something close to a command crisis. Bradley called Eisenhower, furious beyond diplomatic constraint. He could not, he declared, serve under Montgomery. If Eisenhower intended to give the British Field Marshal permanent command of American forces, Bradley would resign. The ultimatum was not an idle threat. Bradley, normally the most diplomatically skilled of American commanders, had reached his breaking point. Eisenhower, recognizing that Allied unity hung by a thread, attempted to calm Bradley while privately drafting a message to the combined chiefs of staff. In it, he stated plainly that he would request Montgomery as relief unless the Field Marshal apologized and ceased his public criticisms. The war had been won, Eisenhower implied, but whether the alliance survived victory remained uncertain. The crisis was resolved only after intense British pressure forced Montgomery to recognize his error. On January 12th, Montgomery wrote to Eisenhower, expressing regret and acknowledging that his press conference had caused offense. To Bradley, he sent a conciliatory letter praising American troops and expressing gratitude for the honor of commanding them temporarily. The letters were gracious, apparently sincere, and largely irrelevant. The damage was done. American commanders now understood with absolute clarity that Montgomery would never view them as genuine partners. Every operation would be filtered through Montgomery's assessment of how it affected his reputation. Every failure would be explained by insufficient support or others' errors. Every success would be claimed as validation of Montgomery's wisdom. This pattern was fixed, predictable, and intolerable. But more than personality clashes were at stake. By early 1945, the balance of forces in Europe had shifted so decisively toward American predominance that Montgomery's pretensions to battlefield supremacy had become not merely irritating, but operationally counterproductive. American armies comprised over 60 divisions. British and Canadian forces numbered fewer than 20. American logistics sustained Allied operations. American air power dominated European skies. Yet Montgomery continued behaving as though British wisdom must guide American strength. The contradiction reflected broader tensions in Anglo-American relations. Britain, exhausted by 5 years of war and facing post-war economic collapse, struggled to accept that its global predominance had ended. The United States, emerging as the world's dominant power, was discovering that the military might create political responsibilities that American traditions had not prepared it to assume. Montgomery's inability to adjust to these realities made him a symbol of Britain's difficulty accepting diminished status. Winston Churchill, watching Montgomery's press conference disaster unfold, recognized the danger. He spoke in Parliament on January 18th, carefully calibrating his words to repair Allied relationships. The Battle of the Bulge, Churchill stated clearly, was predominantly an American battle, an American victory, and would be remembered as an ever-famous American triumph. British forces had played a supporting role, as coalition partners should. The speech was diplomatic necessity, correcting Montgomery's narrative and acknowledging military realities. But it also represented Britain's acceptance that the war's remaining campaigns would be primarily American endeavors. British forces would participate, contribute, and share victory. But American commanders would increasingly dictate strategy, direct operations, and claim the credit that their forces' predominance merited. Montgomery, isolated by his own conduct and increasingly irrelevant to operations dominated by American armies, spent the war's final months commanding 21st Army Group in Northern Europe. His operations were professional. His tactical sense remained sound, but his relationship with American commanders never recovered. Bradley avoided him. Patton despised him. Eisenhower tolerated him as political necessity demanded, but never again trusted his judgment or his motives. May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The European War was over. Victory belonged to an allied coalition that had overcome not just Nazi Germany, but also internal divisions that had repeatedly threatened to tear it apart. In the euphoria of peace, old conflicts were temporarily submerged. Montgomery received accolades from a grateful British public. American commanders returned home to celebrations that recognized their achievements. But in memoirs and histories written after the war, the conflicts resurfaced. Montgomery's published recollections, appearing in 1958, reignited old controversies by criticizing Eisenhower and implicitly claiming that Montgomery's strategic vision had been superior. Eisenhower, then President of the United States, broke off personal contact, refusing to correspond with a former colleague who seemed determined to refight battles from a vanished war. Bradley's memoir, published in 1951, meticulously documented instances where Montgomery's conduct had undermined Allied operations. Patton's posthumously published diary revealed the depth of his contempt for the British Field Marshal. American histories of the war, drawing on these accounts and official records, presented Montgomery as talented but difficult, brilliant but insufferable, a commander whose contributions were real, but whose personality made him a liability to coalition warfare. British historians defended Montgomery, arguing that American commanders never appreciated his methodical approach, his concern for casualties, his strategic sophistication. They noted that Montgomery never lost a major battle after assuming command in North Africa. They emphasized that his planning and preparation had made D-Day successful. They suggested that American criticisms reflected jealousy of British professionalism and resentment of British military traditions. The debate continued for decades after the participants' deaths. Historians argued about Montgomery's true contributions, about whether American frustrations were justified, about how personalities affected military operations. Some concluded that Montgomery was a great commander poorly suited to coalition warfare. Others suggested that American commanders, lacking Montgomery's experience, resented his superior judgment. Still others argued that the conflicts reflected inevitable tensions when proud nations attempt to cooperate in existential struggle. But beneath historiographical debates lay a simpler truth, one that American commanders of the Second World War understood with crystalline clarity. Bernard Montgomery, for all his talents, could not treat American forces as equals. Whether this incapacity reflected personal arrogance, cultural prejudice, or British determination to maintain fading supremacy remained debatable. What was indisputable was that Montgomery's conduct poisoned Allied relationships and created unnecessary obstacles to coalition warfare. The American experience with Montgomery provided lessons that outlived the war. Future coalition operations would be structured to prevent personality conflicts from undermining military effectiveness. Command arrangements would be designed to ensure proportional representation and prevent any nation from dominating simply through superior confidence or historical precedent. An American military culture would internalize wariness of allies who confused partnership with subordination. For the Americans who fought alongside Montgomery from Tunisia to Germany, the Field Marshal represented what they believed they had left behind in 1776, the assumption that British wisdom must guide American strength, that colonial enthusiasm required metropolitan sophistication to succeed, that New World energy needed Old World experience to avoid disaster. They discovered that battlefield excellence, industrial might, and military success could not overcome cultural assumptions rooted in centuries of British global dominance. Montgomery never understood this. To his death in 1976, he maintained that his wartime conduct had been appropriate, his criticisms justified, his strategic vision superior to alternatives. He remained convinced that Eisenhower's leadership had been inadequate, that American commanders had lacked his professional competence, that the war could have ended sooner had his advice been followed. American commanders who survived him offered different verdicts. They acknowledged Montgomery's tactical skills, but questioned his strategic judgment. They praised his careful preparation, but noted that wars are won by boldness as well as caution. They conceded his concern for casualties, but observed that Montgomery's caution sometimes allowed enemies to escape destruction. And they concluded with near unanimity that Montgomery's personality made coalition warfare more difficult than necessary. The The final assessment belonged to Eisenhower, writing years after the war. He acknowledged Montgomery's abilities, but noted the Field Marshal's complete inability to understand the political dimensions of coalition command. Montgomery, Eisenhower concluded, was a man whose military talents were undeniable, but whose lack of diplomatic sensitivity made him unsuited for senior command in Allied operations. It was perhaps the most devastating critique possible. Not that Montgomery lacked military competence, but that his virtues were overwhelmed by vices that undermined the very cause he served. In coalition warfare, where personality affects effectiveness as profoundly as tactics or strategy, Montgomery's incapacity for treating allies as partners made him not merely difficult, but dangerous. The Americans learned this lesson through bitter experience. From North African sand to German mud, they discovered that military alliances require more than shared enemies. They demand mutual respect, acknowledgement of partners' contributions, and willingness to subordinate ego to collective purpose. Montgomery, whatever his other qualities, could not meet these requirements. And in that failure lay the answer to why the Americans hated Monty. Not because he was British, not because he was cautious, but because he made them feel like colonial auxiliaries in a war. They were winning soldiers whose blood mattered, but whose judgment did not allies valued, only insofar as they facilitated British glory. That memory outlasted Montgomery, outlasted the generation that served with him, outlasted even the Cold War alliance that grew from wartime cooperation. It served as a permanent reminder that technical excellence cannot substitute for human respect. That battlefield brilliance means little if it alienates those whose cooperation victory requires. Bernard Montgomery was many things: brilliant tactician, careful commander, British hero. But to the Americans who fought alongside him, he was also a cautionary tale about the limits of military genius divorced from diplomatic wisdom. The question was never whether Americans recognized Montgomery's talents. They did. The question was whether Montgomery could recognize theirs. He could not. And in that failure of imagination lay the roots of a bitterness that no amount of shared victory could overcome.